The jet appeared suddenly out of the northern sky, fast, silent, and completely unexpected. On the morning of September 21st, 1953, radar operators near Seoul noticed a single fighter aircraft racing south at nearly 1,000 kilometers per hour. At first, it looked like just another patrol. Another aircraft crossing the tense border between North and South Korea. But within minutes, something unusual became clear. This aircraft was not turning back. Instead, it was heading straight for a South Korean air base. The pilot flying directly into enemy territory. Moments later, the fighter screamed over the runway at Kimpo Air Base, banking sharply before touching down. Soldiers rushed toward the aircraft with weapons ready, expecting a trap, a spy mission, maybe even a suicide attack. But when the cockpit opened, a young pilot climbed out, raised his hands, and calmly surrendered. What stunned everyone even more was the aircraft he had just delivered. It was a Soviet-made MiG-15, one of the most advanced fighter jets in the world at the time. A machine the United States had desperately tried to capture for years, but never could. And now, a single North Korean pilot had just handed one over. But the real mystery was this. Why would a young fighter pilot risk certain death, betray his country, and fly directly into enemy territory, with one of the most valuable military secrets of the Cold War? To understand that moment, we have to go back to the beginning of a war that turned the skies over Korea into one of the most dangerous air battlefields in history. Pause once. In 1950, the Korean peninsula exploded into war. North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and later China, launched a surprise invasion of South Korea. Within weeks, the conflict had drawn in the United States and United Nations forces, transforming the region into a brutal Cold War battleground. But while armies clashed on the ground, another war was unfolding high above the clouds. The war for air superiority. And in that aerial war, one aircraft quickly became legendary. The MiG-15, developed by the Soviet Union. The MiG-15 was fast, powerful, and extremely dangerous. When it first appeared over Korea in late 1950, American pilots were shocked. The jet could climb faster, reach higher altitudes, and carry heavy cannons capable of destroying bombers in seconds. Almost overnight, the balance of air power shifted. The skies above northwest Korea became known as MiG Alley, a narrow strip of airspace where Soviet-designed fighters battled American F-86 Sabres in some of the first large-scale jet-versus-jet combat in history. For the United States, understanding the MiG-15 became a top priority. Engineers wanted to examine its engine, its aerodynamics, its weapon systems, every detail. But there was one problem: no one had ever captured one intact. Many had been shot down, but almost all crashed behind enemy lines. So the US military came up with an unusual idea. If they couldn't shoot down a MiG, maybe they could convince a pilot to steal one. In 1953, the United States launched a psychological warfare campaign known as Operation Moolah. Leaflets were dropped over North Korean airfields promising something extraordinary. Any pilot who flew a MiG-15 to South Korea would receive political asylum, protection, and a reward of up to $100,000. At the time, that was a fortune, worth nearly $1 million today. The plan was simple: offer freedom and money, and hope that one pilot would take the risk. But months passed, and no one defected. Then something completely unexpected happened. 8 weeks after the Korean War armistice was signed, one pilot finally did. But the strangest part was this: he had never even heard about the reward. Pause once. His name was No Kum-sok. He was only 21 years old. Born in what is now North Korea in 1932, No grew up during one of the most turbulent periods in Korean history. His childhood unfolded under Japanese colonial rule, followed by the chaos of World War II and the division of Korea into two hostile states. Like many young men in the newly formed North Korean state, he eventually joined the military. At first, he trained for the Navy. But through a series of tests and recommendations, he was selected for something far more prestigious: pilot training. He was sent to Manchuria, where Soviet instructors trained North Korean pilots to fly advanced jet fighters. There, he learned to fly the MiG-15. It was a powerful machine with swept wings, heavy cannons, and incredible speed. In the hands of a skilled pilot, it could dominate the skies, and No quickly proved himself capable. During the Korean War, he flew nearly 100 combat missions, but behind the uniform and the missions, something inside him was changing. He was beginning to question everything: the propaganda, the strict control of the regime, the constant fear. Even within the military, suspicion and surveillance were everywhere. Pilots worried that any mistake, any rumor, could lead to punishment or worse. No began to think about escape, but escaping from North Korea was nearly impossible. The borders were heavily guarded, and anyone caught trying to flee could face execution. Unless you were a fighter pilot. Pause ones. In September 1953, No was stationed at Sunan Air Base, near Pyongyang. The war had officially ended with an armistice 2 months earlier, but tensions remained extremely high. Every flight was monitored, every aircraft accounted for. But on the morning of September 21st, No saw his chance. He climbed into the cockpit of his MiG-15 and prepared for what looked like a routine training mission. Engines roared to life. The aircraft rolled down the runway and lifted into the sky. For a few moments, everything looked normal. Then he turned south, not gradually, not cautiously, but decisively. He pushed the throttle forward and accelerated toward the heavily fortified border separating North and South Korea. If anyone realized what he was doing, they could shoot him down instantly. Anti-aircraft guns, fighter interceptors, surface-to-air fire. He knew the risk. In his own words later, he believed he had only about a 20% chance of success. But he took the gamble anyway. At nearly 1,000 kilometers per hour, the MiG streaked south across the border. 17 minutes after takeoff, he reached Kimpo Air Base near Seoul. American and South Korean personnel watched in disbelief as the jet approached. For a moment, they feared it was an attack, but instead of firing, the MiG lined up with the runway and landed. Within seconds, armed soldiers surrounded the aircraft. The pilot climbed out, threw down a portrait of North Korean leader Kim Il-sung he had been carrying, and raised his hands in surrender. The Cold War had just produced one of its most astonishing defections. Pause ones. For the United States, the arrival of that aircraft was an intelligence goldmine. The MiG-15 was immediately secured, dismantled, and shipped out of Korea for detailed analysis. American engineers and test pilots examined every inch of the fighter. They studied its engine design, its aerodynamics, and its combat performance. At test facilities in Okinawa and later in the United States, the aircraft was flown repeatedly against American fighters to understand its strengths and weaknesses. The information gathered helped the United States improve its own aircraft and tactics, giving Western pilots a clearer understanding of the Soviet jet that had dominated the early years of the Korean War. Meanwhile, the young pilot who delivered the aircraft was taken into protective custody and interrogated by intelligence officers. That was when they realized something remarkable. He had never heard of Operation Moolah. He had no idea there was a reward waiting for him. When American officials told him about the $100,000 prize, he was stunned. Eventually, he accepted the money. But more importantly, he accepted something else. Freedom. Pause ones. In 1954, No Kum-sok immigrated to the United States. There, he adopted a new name, Kenneth H. Rowe. He went on to study engineering at the University of Delaware, eventually becoming an American citizen and working for major aerospace companies, including Boeing and General Dynamics. The young pilot who once flew combat missions over Korea would later spend decades designing aircraft and teaching future engineers. A completely different life, built from a decision that lasted just 17 minutes in the air. The MiG-15 he delivered still exists today. It sits in the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Ohio, preserved as one of the most valuable aircraft ever captured during the Cold War. But beyond the aircraft itself, the story represents something larger. A reminder that sometimes the most powerful events in history are shaped not by armies, not by governments, but by the decisions of a single person. One pilot, one aircraft, One risky flight across a hostile border. A flight that changed intelligence, technology, and Cold War history forever. Pause twos. And perhaps the most remarkable part of the story is this. The United States spent years trying to capture a MiG-15. But in the end, it wasn't captured in battle. It was delivered by a young pilot searching for freedom. If you enjoy stories about aviation mysteries, Cold War secrets, and incredible real-life missions, make sure to subscribe. Because sometimes the most unbelievable stories in history are completely true.